I think we should start. Let me welcome you on behalf of the interdisciplinary program in law and religion at the law school and the Institute for Social Research at the university to this very, very timely lecture. I'm glad to see that it's not only in my class that students always sit at the back for fear that they'll be called on, you know? I thought this was maybe something unique to me. We have a very exciting lecture today, very timely. Wolfgang Brandstetter, the Minister of Justice for the Republic of Austria, will speak on hate speech legislation in Austria and the European Union. And when we invited him, we didn't realize the extent to which this would be ripped from the headlines, but certainly in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo tragedy in Paris, these issues are front and center, not only for Europe, but for the United States. I want to recognize the presence of George Serratelli, who is Vice President of the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and is also, I believe, a member of the Parliament of Georgia. And we are delighted that he can be with us. And we're particularly delighted about having Minister Brandstetter. This is his second time at the law school. One more time, and in Jewish law, we will have an official custom. So we're looking for the third time. So without further ado, I invite Minister Wolfgang Brandstetter, who I should also point out was a law professor. So if he gets energized, he might be actually calling on you. And he will speak on hate crime legislation in Austria and the EU. Thank you so much.
My dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to speak to you today on the topic of legislation on hate crime and hate speech in Austria and the European Union. To be honest, since I was a professor for criminal law and a criminal lawyer in my former days, I'm not so used to English lectures, and therefore I have to apologize if I miss vocabulary. You should help me, but as friendly as you are, you will help me if this should be necessary. But anyway, it makes sense to discuss this topic just now, as my colleague, Mr. Breger, Professor Breger already pointed out. We are still shocked after this terror attacks in France and before in Belgium, and it is still topic number one in Austria too. As you see, this is our leading news magazine, can be compared to Newsweek, always the story number one, Islamism, problems with Islam, and therefore, well, we have to cope with that, and we have to try to find out what's behind, what are the reasons for that. And, well, what is so shocking for us in Europe is that in this case we see that religious sentiments, religious feelings can be misled, misused. They are a power of violence. And this is tragic because for us, religion always was a power for peace. And, well, this situation is not really new in history. I found out that already George Washington at his times said, "Of all the animosities which have existed among mankind, those which are caused by a difference of sentiments in a religion, appear to be the most inveterate and distressing, and ought most to be deprecated. So it was a problem in the days of George Washington, and the problem as such, it has history, so let's do what we can that it shouldn't have a future. By the way, it's not by chance that I picked this tie today, the constitutional tie, the tie of the Bill of Rights, in honor of George Washington and the American Constitution we will have to talk about later. I see another gentleman who picked the right tie today. Thank you for that. It's a very nice tie. But now back to the really serious problems we have to discuss about. Throughout my lecture, I want to discuss the terms hate crime and hate speech first, outline the applicable European legal framework and legislation in Austria, give you some examples of recent case law of Austrian courts, and discuss the relationship between the fundamental right of freedom of speech on the one hand and the criminalization of hate speech on the other hand, from the perspective of European and Austrian law. Finally, I hope that we will have some time to discuss your follow-up questions. So let's talk about hate crime and hate speech. Hate crime can be defined as any criminal act committed out of a specific discriminating motive. Usually, the victim of the crime is selected out of a discriminating motive. There has to be a characteristic feature which is attributed to the whole group, such as ethnic origin, nationality, or gender. In general, hate crimes are not limited to any specific offense, but in most cases, they involve or lead to violence. That's what makes them so dangerous, and that's why we have to react with criminal law too. The target can be a person, a group of persons, or property owned by such persons or groups. Hate speech is speech that incites to violence against a protected group, or that disparages or intimidates such a group on account of physical or mental characteristics strongly attributed to the members of the group. Hate speech may also be directed against individuals on account of their assumed belonging to a certain group. The term speech has to interpret it in a very broad sense and includes any expression of thoughts, no matter if in verbal, written, or electronic form. Hence, for example, also postings on the internet can constitute hate speech. In fact, a very big problem for us just now. Now, I want to turn to the legal framework in detail. Here we have to make a difference between the European and the Austrian law. In the field of hate crime, and especially in the field of hate speech, there are a number of international legal documents. Some of them are binding for Austria, and some of them are non-binding, but contain recommendations. From the perspective of Austria, the following international legal instruments are of particular relevance. First, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Second, the European Union Framework Decision on combating certain forms and expressions of racism and xenophobia. Third, the additional protocol to the Council of Europe's Convention on Cybercrime concerning the criminalization of acts of a racist and xenophobic nature committed through computer systems, and the General Policy Recommendation number 7 of the European Commission against Racism and Intolerance. You will have noticed that I mentioned a number of different European organizations, in particular the Council of Europe, ECRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, and the European Union. So let me briefly introduce these institutions to you. The Council of Europe is a basically European but international organization promoting cooperation between all countries of Europe in the areas of legal standards, human rights, democratic development, the rule of law, and cultural cooperation. It currently has 47 member states, including Russia and some other former states of the Soviet Union, and it is an entirely separate body from the European Union. So it goes beyond the European borders as we traditionally see it. The probably best known body of the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights, which enforces the European Convention on Human Rights. And this European Court of Human Rights is of particular relevance for Austria, since the European Convention on Human Rights has the status of constitutional law in Austria. But anyway, the decision of this court is binding for all the member states. Another body of the Council of Europe, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, is a human rights body of the Council of Europe consisting of independent experts who monitor problems of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, intolerance and discrimination on grounds such as race, national, ethnic origin, color, citizenship, religion and language. ECRI prepares reports and issues recommendations to member states. One of these recommendations is General Policy Recommendation number 7, which contains recommendations on national legislation to combat racism and racial discrimination. Well, the European Union is essentially, as you know, a supranational organization of 28 member states. The European Union has its own institutions and its own legislative procedure. Its legislative acts are directly or by way of an obligation to transpose it into international law, and indirectly mandatory for all member states. So we are bound to that. The European Court of Justice has jurisdiction to rule on questions of European law. For example, the European Court of Justice may rule in a so-called infringement proceeding that a member state has violated its obligation to correctly transpose an act of European legislation into its national law. And the member state, they can convict it by this court, European Court of Human Rights. One such act of European legislation is of special relevance when talking about hate crime and hate speech. This is the European Union Framework Decision on combating certain forms and expressions of racism and xenophobia. And this framework was adopted by member states on November 28, 2008, after 7 years of negotiations. The framework decision requires member states of the European Union to ensure that certain conduct is punishable by effective, proportionate, and dissuasive criminal penalties. First, publicly inciting to violence or hatred directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin, including the commission of such crimes by public dissemination or distribution of pamphlets, pictures, or other material. So we are obliged to have criminal sanctions against such crimes. Second, publicly approving, denying, or grossly trivializing genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, with special emphasis on Nazi crimes. The member states, they can choose to punish such poisoned messages and activities only if they are carried out in a manner likely to disturb public order or are threatening, abusive, or insulting. But basically, they have to do what they can against these sort of crimes. And as I have mentioned before, European Union member states are obliged to transpose such European Union legislation into their national law. Whether member states actually comply with such obligations or not is monitored by the European Commission. In the context of framework decision, the European Commission in January 2014, so recently, has issued a report on the implementation of the framework decision in the member states. As of December 2014, it would be possible for the European Commission to start infringement proceedings against any member state for not having implemented the framework decision in its national law. Let me now turn to the provisions dealing with hate crime and hate speech under Austrian law in compliance with the European law, as mentioned before. As far as hate crime is concerned, the crime as such, be it an assault causing bodily injury or be it intentional damage to property, is punishable under Austrian criminal law. However, if the court finds that the crime was committed out of a discriminating motive, for example, for racist or xenophobic reasons, the court will rule that this constitutes an aggravating circumstance and that causes a higher sentence, of course. And as far as hate speech is concerned, the Austrian Criminal Code contains a provision on hate speech in its section 283. Its paragraph 1 deals with the public incitement to violence against groups of people or individuals because of their belonging to such a group protected by law. And the groups which are protected by this section 283 of our criminal law are defined on the grounds of race, color, language, religion, nationality, descent, gender, disabilities, age, or sexual orientation. Paragraph 2 of section 283 prohibits the public incitement to hatred against any of the mentioned protected groups, as well as abuses which violate the human dignity of such groups. All offenses under section 283 of the Criminal Code are currently punishable by a prison sentence of up to 2 years. At the moment, we have a discussion ongoing in Austria regarding amendments to this provision because of a case that happened last summer near Salzburg. The problem was that a soccer club from Israel, Maccabi Tel Aviv, they had their training camp there, and there was a soccer game, and some of the members of the Maccabi Tel Aviv club, they were attacked by young Palestine people, young men, and since they were trained very well, they didn't suffer injury like that over there. They were not really hurt, but it was an attack, and the people, the attackers, used their pamphlets and paroles. So of course there's a criminal procedure going on against these people, but on this occasion we saw that our special paragraph has to be changed because up to now there's a certain standard of public perception necessary for this application of this section 283. that means that at least 150 people should see what happens. And in this case, only 15 people were there, so this very hard sanction is not applicable. So therefore, we want to change section 283 and make the level of public perception lower. So this will happen probably this year. Furthermore, the Austrian Criminal Code contains provisions on the incitement to commit punishable acts and approval of punishable acts, and on the incitement to commit terrorist acts and approval of terrorist acts. Also, I would like to briefly mention the so-called Verbotsgesetz. This is a German word for it. And this law was passed following World War II and contains a number of criminal offenses, in particular prohibits any re-engagement in Nazi activities of any kind. Furthermore, this law makes punishable the so-called Auschwitz lie, which means approving of, denying, or grossly trivializing the genocide or other Nazi crimes against humanity in a way that this becomes known to the broad public. Now, let's turn to other examples for our case law. In 2011, there was a trial against 4 young defendants who had shouted Nazi slogans in front of a group of Muslims. 2 of the defendants had also fired shots from a pistol into the group of Muslims. All of the defendants were convicted to prison sentences. Typical example for hate crime. In 2013, there was an assault with a knife on an African man. Even during court trial, the defendant upheld that he was personally opposed to black people, and when convicting him, the court ruled that this aggravating circumstance of a racist motive had to be applied. And again, in 2013, there also was a trial against 3 persons who tried to set a mosque on fire. They too were convicted, and the aggravating circumstance that they had acted out of a racist motive was applied. And in 2013 too, a group of Romanian citizens that belong to the Roma minority settled with their mobile homes outside of an Austrian town. Following their settling down, calls for violence against them were published on the internet. You know, social media are not always social, but because of that, they were publicly insulted because of being part of the Roma minority. 8 people were convicted for hate crime under section 283. You probably know that we have big problems like that, especially in Hungary now. So I'm sure that you will ask, what about hate speech and freedom of speech? You are used to freedom of speech. Well, of course, it is necessary to talk about hate speech legislation versus freedom of speech. The prosecution of hate speech should secure the possibility of equal participation of all people in public life. Also, it should ensure security for the protected groups or individuals concerned. However, one must not ignore that the prosecution of hate speech to some extent conflicts with another fundamental right, the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression. Well, here we have a different situation in Europe. In this context, the European Commission, in its report of 2014 on the implementation of the framework decision in the Member States, stated that the fight against racism and xenophobia must be framed within a fundamental rights context. The framework decision is based on the need to protect the rights of individuals, groups, and society at large by penalizing particularly serious forms of racism and xenophobia while respecting the fundamental rights of freedom of expression and association. The framework decision must be applied in conformity with fundamental rights, in particular freedom of expression and association. But, as I have mentioned before, in Austria, the European Convention on Human Rights has the rank of a constitutional law. And Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, constitutional law for us, states that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. But, however, paragraph 2 of this Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights allows certain limitations, and that's what we make use of. The exercise of these freedom rights may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society, in the interests of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the justice system. So we in our legal system make use of such limitations, obviously to a large extent compared to the United States. As far as our strict restrictions for and criminal sanctions against Nazi propaganda is concerned, it can be explained by historical reasons. But due to that, the European Court of Human Rights allows us restrictions of freedom of speech in order to protect the groups I mentioned before, in accordance with our constitutional law, which is identical in this sense with the European Convention of Human Rights. And in the meantime, there are quite a number of decisions of the European Court of Human Rights that deal with the relationship between hate crime legislation and freedom of speech. As a general rule, one can state that the European Court of Human Rights has upheld that it may be necessary in democratic societies to sanction or even prevent all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify hatred based on intolerance. If certain acts are considered to be hate crimes by the European Court of Human Rights, they do not have the protection of freedom of speech under Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. So for us, hate speech is just misusing freedom of speech, and therefore it shouldn't be protected. So I hope that I could provide you with some insight into the current legal framework concerning hate crime and hate speech in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy if we would have time enough to discuss the whole topic now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I take the liberty of the introducer of starting off with 2 questions, and then we'll go to others. And you have to forgive me, I come from a free speech bias in the United States. So as I understand the rationale for the hate crime in Europe, incitement is one of the reasons. So my question is, does it matter the extent to which the incitement might succeed? For example, immigrants route, throw immigrants out, That's a sentiment that is not totally unpopular, so you would say, well, maybe that will succeed. If someone starts, I hate blonde women, and throw out blonde women out, well, you know everyone's going to laugh at it. The only person he might be worried about is his own safety. So I wonder how much that makes a difference. Secondly, I just want to make an observation about the Holocaust denial law. And few people can be as focused on Nazi issues as myself. But it strikes me as very strange to put someone in jail for being an idiot. I'm not referring necessarily to like Nazi propaganda or any other propaganda, but the statement that the Holocaust didn't occur is, I mean, as a professor, I give them an F, I don't put them in jail. It's like a factual error. It's not a kind of policy error or raising a flag. So take a fellow like David Irving, who's a British historian, who at least supposedly at one time was a good historian, but then descended into kind of Holocaust denial idiocy. So he was, I believe, in Germany, not in Austria. He was put in jail for his book. So recognizing the historical circumstances and realizing that countries in Europe, and if I may say this, particularly Germany and Austria, have to be very much on guard on these issues. The actual a factual stupidity, as opposed to some other action, just seems to be strange to make it criminal. So I'd be interested in your responses to these. I'm sorry to start out with tough questions, but what can I do?
No. Thank you for your questions. I will answer the second question first, because it's easier. Since, well, you have to know that our special laws against the denial of Nazi crimes have historical reasons, and I won't touch that. I mean, I understand your arguments, but on the other hand, we don't have any consideration to change this. I mean, the Kurds have the possibility to, especially if young people are involved, just to give them sentences that make sense. As you say, it's in some cases it's just a question of stupidity, yes. But on the whole, we shouldn't change these special laws. We have them, and by the way, they were a condition for the treaty that made Austria a free country again. And so this law was included as a condition of this treaty that was signed by the United States too, as you know. So this is just what we have, and we won't even touch it. So we have to cope with it, and it's not really a problem. And your first question is, of course, not so easy to be answered. What we want to hit by criminal law is exactly the point where inciting through hate speech, inciting violence is really dangerous. And it's up to the Kurds to decide if it's dangerous or not. So, as you mentioned, if someone says, well, I hate all blonde women or something like that, it's nonsense, you know, it's not dangerous. It's a question of stupidity again. But if it's really dangerous, if hate speech could cause violence, well, then we want to fight it with criminal law too. That's what we're doing with a sentence up to 2 years. So, as I said, the example of the attack against this Israeli soccer players, okay, I think this deserves a strong reaction by the state, and that's what we are doing. But it's not dangerous for someone to say anything something very stupid in his restaurant or inn to his friends. So normally this is not dangerous. But if it can be dangerous, if it is able to just to bring other people to do the same, then we should do what we can do against that, and that's why we have this criminal law, and we're just now making it a bit sharper.
Well, let me think. Mr. Collins is
By the way, if you are interested in that, show it to you.
Oh,
Could be compared to Newsweek or Time magazine.
Professor Brager touched on something that I wanted to just drill down on a little bit further, and that is this notion of hate speech being interpreted so broadly as to, for example, in dealing with the immigration issue, if you're challenging the presence of a group, for example, Muslims in Austria, and saying that there are too many of them here, they're not assimilating properly in our society and our culture, therefore they should be either excluded, or those that are there that aren't citizens perhaps removed. Where does that become hate speech in your interpretation of your law? I mean, because you are identifying a group of people based on perhaps ethnicity, religion, or both, and suggesting that they are really not assimilating into the culture of Europe or Austria. I'm just curious as to where does that become hate speech, and where does that become a discussion of immigration policy?
Yes. Understand your question. You're totally right. A serious debate about problems caused by immigrants, especially immigrants who do not really want to integrate, can never be criminalized, no question of it. But it's up to the court to decide, in any case, if hate speech really, under certain circumstances, led to violence or was able to lead to violence. This is the point where we have to make the decision. And we have such cases. So a normal debate won't be a problem. But if we have a group of, let's say, 20 or 30 young men just attacking, first verbally attacking a group of Roma minority, so then you feel it could be dangerous. And if you have the feeling this is a dangerous situation and we have to expect violence in this case, then if the police is there, they can stop it and we will have a criminal procedure. And I think it's okay.
Since we're not used to ministers of justice in the United States who we can have analytical and intellectual discussions with, you'll forgive me if I just pursue a minute. You also see his example. I don't want to pick on it. You have dealt quite properly with the incitement, but there's also, according to your law, the dignity of the person or the group. I don't know. So a lot of people say, well, if you say something like that statement about immigrants, you are attacking the dignity of the immigrant or the right of their culture. So I'm just wondering how much that plays in it. I can tell you, for example, in Canada there was a case of some strange case of a lay preacher who quoted the Bible on homosexuality, not always such good things, and he was charged with hate speech. The appeals court overturned it. But the question is, he wasn't inciting, even though he's making this is what this book says, let's say, but it certainly attacked the dignity of the protected group. So that is an area that I'd be interested in your view.
Well, I think a case like that could lead to a criminal procedure in Austria too. I think so.
You couldn't rely on the fact that he survived.
No.
Questions? There must be some questions. Yes, and please identify yourself.
Mr. Minister, thank you for coming to our university. My question is, once an individual is prosecuted for hate speech and they're already in prison, what measures or programs are taken to actually rehabilitate them and change their thoughts, rather than gravitating towards people with like-minded thoughts and joining a gang, and then when 2 years come and go, they engage in even more antisocial behavior after they're released?
Well, it depends on the age of the defendant, of the person. We are faced with the fact that especially very, very young people in Austria are misled and misused by Islamistic thoughts, and therefore you can find, in Austria you can find girls of 14, 15 years of age who by all means want to join the so-called jihad and try to leave the country. They're heading for Syria. So of course it doesn't make any sense to put them into jail. We do this if we can, but then of course we have to do what we can just to convince them, to teach them. So this must be the right way. Prevention is better than sanction, especially for the young people, young defendants, no question of it. If you have someone quite old who is totally convinced since a very long time that he has to do this in this way, okay, then if he's really dangerous, it's better you keep him in jail. But the real problem is that so many young people are really under this influence, under this poisoned influence, and we have about 170, especially young people in Austria, who wanted to leave the country to join terroristic groups, especially in Syria and even in Iraq. So, as far as I know, up to now, about 40 of them were killed somehow. About 30 to 40 of them came back. Up to now, 15 of them, 15 are still in jail. So it's really a horrible situation. I mean, it's of course a question far beyond criminal law. So you have to find out the reasons for these young people to support terroristic organizations like ISIS. I mean, this has to do with social situation. It's a question of education. It's a question of chances they have, or maybe did not have. So we're doing what we can to strengthen the sensibility for this problem, which is not only a problem for me as a Minister of Justice, it's a problem for the whole government. But basically, it's a phenomenon. It's hard to understand it. But as I said, I mean, it doesn't make sense just to put these young people into jail and then keep them in jail. It doesn't make sense. We have to find out how we can really help them. And I mean, it's sad enough if you get the information that again one young Austrian this is a typical case, whose parents came to Austria, well, 30, 40 years ago during the Yugoslavian wars, that they are radicalized and they are joining these terrorist groups now. So it's, I'm convinced that it is a misusing of religion. And if you talk to Islam people and to people who really know what Islam is and should be, they tell you that these terroristic activities don't have anything to do with the real Islam. But this is really depressing that religion is such a force, especially for young people, that can be used for good things or can be misused for things like that. And that's what we are confronted with now.
In the back.
I'm just curious if any other historical massacres besides the Holocaust are legal to deny. The treatment of the American Indians or the Ottomans in Armenia, something like that. And just the Holocaust can deny, whereas it
Well, congratulations, you hit the crucial point of our law system. I have to admit that the critics of our Verbotsgesetz, they always say it's strange that in Austria you can deny the horrible crimes of Stalin, nothing will happen. But of course you must not deny the Nazi crimes, and if you do so, you will be put into jail. Okay, this is for historical reasons, and I won't touch it, but you are right. And by the way, I mean, we are, I assume most of all are Catholics. I'm Catholic too, but we shouldn't forget that in our history we had some similar phenomena. If you take a look at what happened in Germany, in northern Germany, during the 16th century, the so-called Wiedertäufer movement, you know, you will find the same phenomena, the same terroristic action, of course, on the circumstances of that time. But it's always a danger if religion is just used to incite people and makes people extremely aggressive and supporting terrorist action. So you can Google it. Wiedertäufer, Münster, Germany, 16th century. It's quite the same as an historical example.
I know that we've been talking about criminal law specifically. I was wondering if there are any other civil institutions, legally, such as Bank of America, who are very concerned about hiring practices or discrimination that would be coming to court. I was wondering if there was anything like that instead in Austria with regard to different ethnicities or racial groups or religions.
Well, I'm not sure if I got your question, but I can tell you that we have very hard and strong restrictions against discrimination anyway. They are based on European law, and this is binding for us. So I don't see any lack of restrictions in this sense. So, but by the way, of course, I have to add that coming back to the Wiedertäufer, they were not really Catholic. They presumed to be Lutheranian, but in fact they were terroristic. So just to make it clear.
Okay, I would like to tackle one point you tried to describe as a problem. That is, are there any limits of what you can write, what you can attack in a written way, what you can point out in pictures, etc. If some groups may be offended by that, it is of course a challenge. Where is the limit, and how far can the freedom of expression go? Do you think that there might be some development of finding some limits, because it can provoke, of course, as we know in history, quite enormous consequences?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's typical. I brought my old friend with me, and he's asking me the hardest question, of course. Well, it's really a difficult question. I'll try it this way. I mean, freedom of speech, for me and for you, is not the same as freedom of speech for artists. So we have more freedom for artists in our traditional, no, not only culture, juridical system. So it is absolutely acknowledged by the courts that if an artist makes use of freedom of expression in his special artistic way, it can be compared to someone else who is just crying out paroles that are able to incite people to violence. So this is a big difference. So we don't have real problems with artists and drawers and authors. They have their freedom according to our traditional court system. So I don't see a problem in this way. But you have to be an artist to have more freedom in Austria. Huh? So it wouldn't be enough. Wouldn't be enough. Yeah.
So anyone on this end, I feel the left hand, maybe this is politics, but the left side of our parliament has not been very expressive. Sir, go ahead.
Mr. Minister, my question is, do you feel that having the freedom of artistic expression might incentivize certain groups to undertake artistic action in order to propagate hate speech?
Well, this could happen, but it is up to the court to decide if this is really artistic action or not. I mean, I don't think that what could be seen in Charlie Hebdo would have been sanctioned in Austria. I don't think so. Don't think so.
Sarah Duggan.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Nice to meet you. It's great to have you here with us. Thank you for coming. I have a more specific question. I believe I understood you to say that when a court is looking at hate speech, it looks to see whether there really is true danger of incitement and in the nature of that danger. Is that simply with respect to sentencing, or is it actually in evaluating whether there is a crime? Because over the years in the United States, we've gone from some sort of vague standards about clear and present danger to ideas about needing an immediate kind of incitement to punish certain kinds of speech. Very rare, but an evolution of tests. Are there any particular tests, or is that within the discretion of the court?
Well, that's a crucial point again. It's not really necessary that violence already has been caused by such a speech. It's enough if a judge thinks that this speech, this hate speech in this situation was really dangerous. This is enough.
So it's the judge's discretion.
Yes.
As opposed to
Yes. It's up to the judges to decide that. Yes. Yes.
Vice President Cirilli.
Thank you, Minister. We really appreciate your comments and your information, what's going on in Europe and in Austria particularly. The issue is very important and it's really burning, and we see results of hate activities and hate speech in many countries, and the last events in France and some other in Belgium. Also, it's really threatening societies. But the main thing, and it was also reflected in a question, in a few questions, that the most difficult thing is to keep balance between freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And even in a convention of human rights, we have Article 10, which is assuring and guaranteeing freedom of speech, and we have Article 17, which then limiting when it's necessary to prevent crimes and other complications. But what you said, and you touched this very interesting point about artists and their responsibilities. So the question came up to my mind, what about politicians? Because we know that sometimes, and it's quite evident that politicians could also deliver hate speeches in very artistic manner. So, it's my interest. Sometimes it's happening in my parliament, it's happening in Congress and everywhere. So we have unfortunate examples of that, and that's influencing that societies much more severely than art.
No,
Yeah, that's my question. What's a practice, for instance, in Austria and other European countries, but specifically in Austria, when politicians are doing that? Because there are some other laws also ensuring some immunity or security for politicians for their expression in the parliament, or different regulations. What is specifically in Austria? You have your huge practical or maybe statistical information in terms of violations of such legislation by politicians.
Well, politicians who are members of the parliament, they are protected by immunity. Members of the government aren't. That's why we have to be careful, because the laws are applicable for us. But the members of the parliament, they are protected by immunity, and therefore you can find a lot of stupid sentences during a debate in the Houses of Parliament. Sorry for that, but it's not only in Austria, it's the whole European system.
Politicians beyond the parliament, there are others, parties and others.
Well, if it has a link to their profession as a politician, then they are protected too. So this is the reason.
Do you know any case to, for instance, punish any or charge any politician?
Yes, we had a case of a politician 2 years ago. She wasn't a member of a parliament, and she was sentenced because of violating this Verbotsgesetz, the law again. She was? I'm not sure. No, she but she didn't say this in the parliament. It was well. I don't really know. I don't remember the certain circumstances. But basically, it's possible that politicians are sanctioned too, but not if they say anything during a debate in the House of Parliament. This is totally protected.
We'll close with a question from Bob at the death row, and then Bob, you'll close us out.
Okay. Mr. Minister, thank you for coming again, and also thank you for the very nice meetings time.
I gave it to you last time I was here in September.
Yeah. Now, does the law tell the court what factors it's supposed to use, or can it focus, does it focus on the nature of the speech, or does it focus on the nature and the setting of the speech? You know, is it possible to be convicted, basically, because of the nature of the speech without regard to the nature of the second?
No, to make it clear, it's not only a question of the nature of the speech, but also a question of the circumstances. The speech has to be dangerous referring to causing violence. That's the point.
Well, you'll
Thank you very much.
I have to thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. In the name of the Law and Religion program, we thank you for coming. And as you can see, you know, all those questions about separation of church and state that everybody kind of thinks about when they think about law and religion come home to roost when we talk about these kinds of cases and these kinds of questions. So we thank you for coming. We thank you for your attention. And we also thank and welcome everybody who's going to be visiting us by video. Thank you all.
Thank you for your patience. And if you allow me to do so, I would like to say, as the most well-known Austrian in the United States usually says, I'll be back. Thank you.